Ruth Calla had lived in that house for 31 years. She knew which step creaked third from the top. She knew the kitchen window stuck in August and rattled loose in January. She knew the smell of the place wood polish and old coffee, and the particular quiet of a house where two people had stopped talking about anything that mattered a long time ago and had learned to call that quiet normal. She knew all of it. What she didn't know was that on a Tuesday morning in October, while she was standing in the grocery store on Millbrook Avenue, holding a can of soup, she almost put back because Warren tracked receipts, and had for years the way some men tracked things. Not because they needed to, but because tracking was how they reminded you who kept the numbers her husband of 31 years was back at the house on Clover Ridge Road changing the locks. She had been gone 40 minutes. Milk, bread, the soup. A small thing, the soup. 49 cents more than the store brand. And she had stood there in the canned goods aisle long enough that a teenage boy stocking shelves had glanced at her twice. She put it in the basket anyway. It was the first time in recent memory she had done that without calculating what Warren would say when he saw the receipt laid out on the kitchen counter, the way he laid receipts out, smoothed flat with the edge of his thumb, before he said anything at all. She came home and saw the porch light on. Warren never turned it on before dark. She noticed that first. Before the suitcase, before the locked door, before any of it, she noticed the porch light burning pale and unnecessary in the flat gray of a Kentucky October morning, and something in her chest went still and careful, the way it went still when she was processing a discrepancy in a county record, and knew before she had found it that something was wrong. The feeling wasn't panic. It was older than panic. It was the feeling of a woman who had spent 31 years learning to read a house the way other people read weather. The suitcase was there second. Her old one, the brown leather one from the back of the bedroom closet, the one she hadn't touched since a trip to visit her sister in Knoxville 8 years ago. It was standing upright by the front door, like it had been placed there with intention, like someone had thought about exactly where it should go and put it there on purpose. Beside it, 2 plastic trash bags tied at the top, the shapes of folded things pressing against the inside of the plastic from within. Ruth stopped at the bottom porch step. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at the door. She took out her key and put it in the lock. It went in halfway, then stopped. She pulled it out, looked at it the way you looked at something familiar that had suddenly become a stranger, the same object it had always been, performing a completely different function. She tried again. The key went in the same distance and stopped at the same place and told her the same thing it had told her the first time. She knocked. Footsteps crossed the living room. Slow, deliberate. The walk of a man who had decided how he was going to enter a room, well before he entered it, who had rehearsed his expression and settled on a posture, and was now performing both with the confidence of someone who had practiced. Warren opened the door 2 inches and kept his hand on the frame. He looked at her the way he looked at things he had already made decisions about. "The lawyers will be in touch," he said. "Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be." He closed the door. Across the street, a curtain moved in the Pelham's front window. They'd lived there 14 years. Ruth had worked alongside Dennis Pelham on the county records management committee for 6 of those. She knew his wife's name, his daughter's school, the return address on the birthday cards that arrived from his mother in Chattanooga every March without fail. Nobody came out. Ruth did not look at the curtain. She crouched down and unzipped the suitcase. Her clothes were folded neat, the way Warren folded things when he wanted credit for being careful. Edges aligned, sleeves tucked, everything compressed into a precision that was really just control, wearing the costume of consideration. 2 sweaters, 3 blouses, her winter nightgown, a pair of slacks she hadn't worn since the previous Thanksgiving. Her blood pressure medication in the front pocket, the orange bottles lined up in a row, labels facing out. He had remembered her blood pressure pills. That was the part that made her chest go tight. Not the locked door, not the trash bags, not the curtain moving across the street while nobody came out. The blood pressure pills arranged carefully in the front pocket of a suitcase he had packed to remove her from her own house. He had remembered them the way a person remembered something when they wanted to be able to say, later hand to heart, that they had been thoughtful about the whole thing, that they had taken care, that whatever happened next, nobody could say they hadn't been decent about it. She moved the clothes aside. At the bottom, wrapped in a page from the Pike County Examiner, dated 3 weeks prior, was a small wooden box she hadn't seen in 15 years. Her father's. Harlan Goss had kept it on the shelf above his workbench in the garage on Sycamore Street, and she used to climb on a step stool to reach it when she was small, pressing her palms flat on the shelf edge and pulling herself up to see what was inside. The cedar smell came through even now, even through the newsprint, even through 15 years of wherever Warren had kept it, without ever once mentioning that it existed. Ruth picked it up with both hands. She did not open it. Not there on that porch with the Pelham's curtain still moving, and Warren's footsteps somewhere on the other side of the door, moving away, now retreating back into the house that no longer had a key that fit her. But she held it. The weight of it, the worn corners, the brass latch, gone green at the edges from age and handling. She held it the way you held something that had no business being where you found it, that had arrived through a sequence of events that was only beginning to make sense. He had packed her father's box himself, which meant he had held it, which meant he had known it was there somewhere in that house for 15 years since her father's funeral, when she had been too hollowed out by grief to watch carefully what Warren touched and what he set aside, and had decided without curiosity, without a single question asked, in 15 years of marriage following that funeral, that whatever was inside was nothing worth knowing about. Ruth stood up, put the box under her arm, and carried the suitcase to her car. She did not look back at the door. The motel on Route 23 was called the Ridgeline Motor Inn, and it smelled like industrial cleaner and the memory of cigarettes smoked by people who were long gone. The heater in room 7 made a sound like it was apologizing for its own inadequacy. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, not the middle, the edge, the way you sat when you weren't sure yet whether you were staying or whether staying was even a category that applied to you anymore, and set the wooden box on the nightstand under the lamp. The suitcase stood against the wall, the 2 trash bags on the floor beside it, her wool coat draped over the chair in the corner, because there was nowhere else to put it, and she wasn't ready to use the closet yet. Using the closet felt like something you did when you had decided to be somewhere for a while, when you had stopped waiting to go back. Her phone was on the nightstand. 4 messages from Travis Calla Warren's son, 37 years old real estate attorney on the south side of Lexington. She had known him since he was 6 years old, a quiet boy who had needed help with his reading and who she had sat with at the kitchen table on Sycamore Street 3 afternoons a week for a full winter, until the words started coming more easily. She had signed his birthday card, Mom Ruth, for 18 years because he had asked her to shyly when he was 12, and she had said yes without fully thinking through what it meant to give something like that freely to someone who hadn't yet demonstrated whether they deserved it. She did not open the messages. Outside, trucks downshifted on Route 23 one after another through the night, the sound of commerce moving through the dark. She knew this stretch of road. She had driven it for 31 years, had processed the land records for 3 commercial properties along this corridor, knew the names of the families who had owned the parcels on either side of the highway, going back through the county deed books to the early 1970s. She knew Pike County the way a person knew a place they had served faithfully for a long time, without anyone thinking to ask what exactly they had learned in the process of that service. She was 64 years old. She had spent 31 years as head clerk of the Pike County Land Records Office, the last 12 as department supervisor. She had processed 11,241 property transfers in that time. She knew the number because she had counted once for a retirement speech she had been asked to give for a colleague and had quietly adapted for herself standing in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening, thinking about what 31 years actually added up to when you laid it out plainly. She had caught 4 instances of deed fraud, 2 cases of forged notarization, and 1 attempted transfer of a deceased person's mineral rights without proper probate clearance. She had caught all of them because she paid attention to the things most people assumed didn't matter. The small discrepancies, the dates that didn't align, the signatures that looked right but felt slightly off in ways that took a trained eye to name. Tonight, nobody in Pike County knew which room she was in. She sat with that for a moment, turned it over, examined it from both sides the way she examined a document she wasn't sure about, looking for what it was telling her beneath what it appeared to be saying. Then she reached for the wooden box. The cedar smell rose when she turned it over in her hands, checking the latch the way her father had shown her when she was 12 years old, standing in the garage on Sycamore Street with the workbench light on and her father's hands guiding hers. Press here first, then lift. It sticks if you just pull. You have to give it a moment before you ask it to open. She pressed. she lifted. Inside a piece of paper folded into quarters, and underneath it, resting in the cedar-lined bottom of the box, an iron key. The key was heavier than it looked. Old style, the kind with a long shaft and a wide bow at the top. The teeth gone rough with rust at the tips from years of sitting in the same place. She held it in her palm and looked at it the way you looked at something you recognized without being able to say from where, like a word you knew the full meaning of, but hadn't said out loud in so many years that it felt both familiar and strange at once. She set the key down and unfolded the paper, her father's handwriting. Block letters pressed hard into the page the way he always wrote, like he wanted to be sure the words had no choice but to stay where he put them. A property address on Garrison Creek Road off County Route 7, Pike County. Below the address, 2 lines. The first gave brief directions. Watch for the rusted mailbox. The lane is unmarked. Take it slow. And below that, underlined twice hard enough that the pen had nearly gone through the paper. Don't let anyone tell you this is nothing. She read it once. She folded it back along the same creases, the paper following the lines of its own history, and set it on top of the key. The trucks on Route 23 kept going. The heater ticked. Ruth did not cry. She sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like other people's years and looked at a folded piece of paper and an iron key that her father had left her. And she thought about the fact that Warren had packed this box into her suitcase without ever opening it. She thought about what that said about a man. 31 years. He had lived with her for 31 years, had eaten at her table, and slept in her bed, and signed his name next to hers on a mortgage, and a dozen other documents she had reviewed more carefully than he had ever bothered to read them. He had held her father's box in his hands sometime in the last day or two. She could picture him finding it on whatever shelf he'd stashed it on 15 years ago, picking it up, weighing it briefly, deciding, and had put it in the suitcase without opening it, without a single question, without one moment of curiosity about what a dead man had left his daughter that was worth keeping in a cedar box with a brass latch. He had decided it was nothing. He had been wrong about that in a way she was only beginning to understand. She turned the iron key over in her palm. Cold at first, then warming slowly, the metal taking on the temperature of her hand. At 4 a.m, she was still awake. She placed the key on the nightstand, where the light from the parking lot came through the gap in the curtain, and landed on it in a thin, precise stripe. She watched the stripe move as the light outside shifted. When the sky went from black to the particular gray that came just before dawn. Not light yet, just the absence of full dark. Ruth got up, put on her coat, and slid the key into her front pocket. She did not check her phone. She did not look at the trash bags. She picked up her car keys and went outside. Garrison Creek Road did not appear on her phone's navigation when she typed it in. The app offered her alternatives roads with similar names in adjacent counties, nothing that matched. She put the phone down on the passenger seat and drove the way her father had taught her to find things by watching for what the map left out, by paying attention to the places where the road got quieter, and the signage got sparser, and the land started asserting itself more strongly than the infrastructure built to cross it. She had been driving for 35 minutes on County Route 7, the road going narrower, with each mile the hills rising on either side, the kind of eastern Kentucky landscape that didn't perform itself for anyone passing through. It was simply what it was, and had always been old and patient and entirely indifferent to whether you found your way through it or not. She almost missed the turnoff. No sign. Just a gravel lane cutting back from the road at an angle, and at the corner, a mailbox rusted the color of old brick leaning into the ditch at a degree that suggested it had given up on perpendicular some years back and settled into a more sustainable position. She pulled to the shoulder and checked the address on her father's paper against the number on the box. They matched. She sat for a moment with the engine idling. 31 years of processing land records had given her a specific, detailed understanding of what happened to property when no one tended it. She had seen the photographs filed with delinquent tax assessments, the before and after of places that had been left alone too long. She knew what abandonment looked like in documentation in assessed value in the particular vocabulary of county records that marked a property's decline. She drove in. The lane was 2 tire tracks with grass grown up the center strip knee-high and gone brown with October. Branches scraped the roof of her car on both sides, the sound patient and continuous, like the land was taking its time deciding whether to let her through. She drove in first gear, slow the way her father had taught her to drive on ground that hadn't been traveled in a long time. You go slow until you know what you're dealing with. Then you can decide how fast to go. What she found at the end of the lane was both worse and better than she had allowed herself to expect. The cabin sat back from the lane in a clearing that had gone mostly to weeds, the grass running knee-high all the way to the porch steps. The roof sagged along the center ridge in the way roofs sagged when they had been holding weight for too long without anyone to share it. The 2 front porch steps had gone dark and soft with rot. A young oak had grown up flush against the left side window, its branches pressing the glass from outside, with the patient insistence of something that had been growing there for years without anyone to redirect it. Ruth sat in the car and looked at it through the windshield. She thought about what Warren had said. Twice in 31 years in her hearing. Nothing out there worth the drive. Both times in response to questions from other people, distant relatives, an estate attorney who'd called the year after her father died about the property on Garrison Creek Road. Both times in the settled final voice he used when he was closing a subject without inviting discussion. She had heard it as fact. That was the kind of marriage it had been, she understood now. The kind where one person's certainty gradually replaced the other person's judgment so slowly and so completely that you forgot there had ever been a difference between the two. She got out of the car. The iron key went into the lock hard and caught part way. She pressed the way her father's note had said, "Press first. Give it a moment, then turn." The lock held. She pressed again, felt something deep inside the mechanism shift and reconsider, turned again, and it gave with a sound that she would think about later. a sound like something that had been holding itself closed for a very long time, finally deciding that the right person had arrived. The door swung inward, cold air and damp wood, and beneath both of those, something else. Something that arrived after the first two smells stepped aside motor oil and old canvas. The smell of a work coat hung on the same hook for years of tools used and cleaned and put back in their places. Ruth stood in the doorway and let it reach her. Then she went in. The front room held a pine table, 2 chairs pushed in neatly, a cast-iron wood stove in the corner with a dented flue pipe running up through the ceiling. A shelf on the far wall held nothing but 3 rusted tin cans lined up at one end, with the precision of someone who had arranged them that way on purpose. The floorboards were wide-cut oak gray, with the particular gray that came from decades of use and cleaning and more use. On the wall beside the door, a set of iron hooks. On the hooks, an orange hunting vest stiff with age and storage. A wool jacket the color of dried autumn leaves. And beside the jacket, hanging from the same nail, a canvas work cap, blue. The brim curved from 40 years of the same hand, putting it on and taking it off, the same way every morning and every evening. The shape of one person's habit pressed permanently into the fabric. Ruth knew that cap. She had watched it disappear into tree lines every November, from the time she was small enough that her father had to carry her for the last stretch up the ridge. She had watched it come back out of the tree line at dusk, her father moving through the last of the light. Unhurried, the cap tilted at its particular angle, the same angle every time, like a fixed point she could navigate by. He had left the hunting gear on the wall, which meant he had always meant to come back to this place, and which meant she understood standing there in the doorway of a cabin she had never visited in 15 years of marriage to a man who had told her there was nothing here worth the drive. It meant that when he had written the address on that piece of paper and sealed it in the cedar box, with the iron key he had believed she would find her way here. Eventually, whether anyone helped her or not. Ruth did not take the cap down. She left it where it was on the nail where her father had left it at the angle he had left it. She found a broom with a cracked handle leaning in the kitchen corner. The kind of broom that had been in the same corner long enough to have become structural part of the room, rather than a tool kept in it. She picked it up and started sweeping. Not because she had a plan, not because she thought sweeping would address what needed to be addressed. Because the floor needed doing, and she was the only one there to do it. And her mother had taught her that you started where you were. You did what was in front of you. The larger things would still require handling when the floor was clean, but they were easier to approach from a clean floor. She was pulling a load of grit toward the back door when the broom caught. Not on the baseboard, on the floor itself. She stopped, looked down. One of the wide oak boards sat a fraction higher than the rest, half an inch, maybe slightly less. Its edge lifted just enough to catch a broom stroke. She pressed on it with her foot. It moved. Not the way a warped board moved, swelling and settling back with changes in moisture and temperature. It moved with intention, the way something moved when it had been designed to move, when someone had built it to open. Ruth had spent 31 years in the business of noticing the thing that didn't fit. She found a butter knife in the kitchen drawer, wooden handle worn to a smooth finish, rounded blade, the kind of knife that was genuinely useless for butter, and well suited to exactly this kind of work. She worked the blade into the seam at the edge of the board, pressed down on the handle, and the board came up with a sound she felt as much as heard. A seal breaking. A space that had been closed for a long time opening back up. Underneath a shallow cavity maybe 8 inches deep, lined with a piece of burlap folded into quarters. On top of the burlap sat a tin box, rectangular, roughly the size of a shoebox, cut in half, its lid rusted at the seams in the specific way that came from many winters in the same damp, cold space. Ruth lifted it out with both hands and set it on the pine table. She worked the lid loose with the butter knife working around the edges, giving the rust time to release. Inside a manila envelope, thick, its paper gone the color of strong tea at the edges where moisture had crept in and been repelled over the years. Wrapped around it 2 loops of wide black electrical tape, the good kind, the kind that lasted. She had watched her father wrap things in this tape when he wanted them to survive whatever came. Her grandmother's pill bottles every winter before a flood season, the deed to the Sycamore Street house when the basement took on water one March. He had sealed this the same way. She peeled the tape off in strips, patient the way it wanted to come. Opened the envelope without tearing it. Inside was a small stack of papers held together at the top left corner by a binder clip gone fully orange with rust. She took them out and laid them on the table one at a time in order. The first page, a mineral rights registration filed with Pike County in 2003. The name on the filing, Harlan G. Goss. Her father's block letters in the signature line pressed hard. The second page was dated 2005. A transfer of mineral rights, notarized. 2 witness signatures in hands she didn't recognize. And on the designated line, the line for the name of the new rights holder, typed clean and unambiguous, Ruth May Calla. She read it once, then she put her finger under each word and read it again slowly, the way she had been trained to read documents that mattered. Not wife of Warren Calla, not Mrs. Warren Calla, not the compound name that had appeared beside his on every joint document she had signed across 3 decades of marriage. Not the name she had gradually learned to write smaller, to tuck beside his, to position as an attachment to his, the way a subordinate clause attached to a main sentence. Ruth May Calla, her name. The name her father had given her before anyone else had any claim on any part of her. Standing on its own on a legal document registered and notarized and witnessed the way a thing stood when someone had made certain it could not be moved. She sat with that for a long moment. Let it settle. Then she set the transfer page to the side and examined what else the envelope held. 3 smaller envelopes sealed, never opened. The return address on all 3 Appalachian Mineral Group, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Each one addressed to R. Calla Garrison Creek Road, Pike County, Kentucky. Each one stamped in red ink on the front face. Return to sender. No recipient on file. Ruth knew that stamp with the intimacy of someone who had applied it herself hundreds of times on mail that couldn't complete its journey. She had pressed it onto envelopes that had the right address and the wrong administrative status envelopes that were going to the correct physical location, but had been separated somewhere in the system from any record of a living registered recipient. The stamp did not mean the address was wrong. It meant someone had made certain there was no active record of a person at that address to receive mail. It meant the gap between the envelope and its intended recipient was not accidental. In 31 years of watching how information moved through county systems and how it was occasionally prevented from moving, Ruth had learned to distinguish between a gap that happened and a gap that was made. She opened the most recent envelope, 2022. A letter on company letterhead. A lease offer for the coal mineral rights beneath the property at Garrison Creek Road, Pike County. An advance payment figure. Monthly royalty terms across 2 careful paragraphs. And at the bottom, in the margin, a handwritten note in a hand she didn't recognize. 3rd attempt. If no response by Q2 file moves to uncontested status. She looked at the date on the letter. March 2022. Warren had told her he wanted a divorce in January 2023. She set the letter down, picked up the 2021 envelope, the 2020 envelope, laid all 3 in a row on the pine table, oldest to newest, left to right, the way she had always sorted the records that told the clearest stories when you understood the sequence they ran in. 3 letters, 3 years, no one home. She sat with the 3 envelopes in front of her and understood with the particular clarity that came from 31 years of reading fine print that other people signed without reading exactly what had been happening. Warren had not stumbled onto the information about this property. Men like Warren did not stumble into anything. They went looking quietly and early in the places most people didn't think to look. He had gone through her father's papers after the funeral. She could see it now, the way she could reconstruct a sequence of events from the documentary evidence they left behind, which was most of what records work actually was. And he had found the cedar box and read the address and understood before she ever did that Garrison Creek Road might be worth something. And then he had kept the box for 15 years. She had asked herself in the months before the divorce why he had waited so long. The answer when she worked through it was straightforward. The coal market in eastern Kentucky had been depressed for years. The mineral rights beneath this property had not been worth acting on until the market shifted. The letters from Appalachian Mineral Group had started arriving in 2020, which was when commodity prices began moving in a direction that made extraction economically attractive again. That was when the window opened. That was when the clock started. And the clock ran until Q2 of whatever year came after the third attempt, which was 2023. Warren had understood the timeline. He had waited until the window was nearly closed, then moved decisively. Packed her out of the house. Handed her by accident because he had never once thought it was worth opening the only thing that could stop him. He had given her the box. He had given her the key. He had given her her father's handwriting, pressed hard into paper so the words would stay. Don't let anyone tell you this is nothing. Ruth folded the transfer document along its original creases. Put the 3 envelopes back in the manila sleeve. Put the sleeve back in the tin box and set the tin box on the table in front of her. Outside, the October wind moved through the tall grass in the clearing. She was 64 years old, and she was sitting in a cabin she hadn't known existed until this morning on land that had been in her name since 2005, looking at 3 letters that a company had sent her, and a 4th that her father had left her, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. She had caught fraud before. 4 times in 31 years. She knew what it looked like. She picked up the tin box and the cedar box and carried them both to the car. She came back and finished sweeping the kitchen floor corner to corner, pulling the dirt toward her the way her mother had taught her. When she was done, she leaned the broom back in its corner. She looked up at the wall above the door, the hunting vest, the wool jacket, the blue canvas cap on its nail brim, curved from 40 years of one hand's habit. Waiting the way her father had always waited, without complaint, without urgency, certain that what he had left behind would find its way to the person it was meant for, whether anyone else thought it was worth the drive or not. The Pike County Land Records Office opened at 9 in the morning. Ruth was there at 8:47, standing on the sidewalk with the manila envelope in a canvas grocery bag, watching a pigeon work methodically at a crack between the front steps. A man in a gray jacket came around the corner, glanced at her, kept walking. She was used to that. 31 years of being the person behind the counter, rather than in front of it, had taught her how to occupy public space without broadcasting a need for acknowledgement. How to be present and patient in a way that made other people comfortable rather than obligated. She had been the person other people brought their problems to for so long that standing on this side of the door felt like wearing a coat that belonged to someone else, familiar in shape, but wrong in some fundamental way she couldn't quite articulate. At 9 o'clock, a young man in a blue lanyard unlocked the front door from the inside. Ruth was first through it. She knew this building the way she knew her own kitchen. She had worked here for 31 years, had learned its filing systems and its rhythms, and the specific quality of afternoon light through the east-facing windows that made reading microfilm difficult between 2 and 4. She had trained 7 clerks at the counter she was now standing on the public side of. She had reorganized the mineral rights filing system once in 2001 and again in 2014, when the county finally converted to a hybrid digital system that still required paper backup for anything predating 1985. The clerk at the front counter looked about 25. His name tag said Garrett. He had the careful, slightly tentative expression of someone who had been in the job long enough to know the procedures, but not long enough to know when the procedures were insufficient for what was actually being presented. Ruth laid the papers in front of him and explained what she had. Mineral rights transfer, notarized 2005, her name on the designated holder line. 3 returned envelopes from an energy company 2020 through 2022. The original mineral rights registration from 2003. She watched his face do the thing faces did when they were reading something they mostly understood, but weren't certain how to handle a kind of careful hedging attention, reading each sentence twice before moving to the next. "I'll need to check with someone," he said. "Can you take a seat?" She sat in the plastic chair by the water cooler and waited. She watched the clock above the service window, the kind with a second hand that moved in small jerks rather than a smooth, continuous arc. She had looked at that clock from the other side of the counter for 3 decades. It looked exactly the same from this side. Time moved in the same small jerks regardless of where you were standing when you watched it. 11 minutes. A door opened behind the counter. The woman who came out was somewhere around 58, maybe 60. Hair the color of winter wheat going to gray, cut short and practical. Reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She moved with the ease of someone who had been doing this work long enough that nothing about it surprised her anymore. Not the documents people brought in, not the situations behind the documents, not the specific combination of damage and hope that walked through the door of a county records office on any given morning in any given year. Her name tag said Dottie Vane. Ruth had known Dottie Vane for 20 years. They had worked in adjacent county offices, served on the same records management committee, twice exchanged the kind of professional courtesies that accumulated over 2 decades of working in the same small county government, without ever quite crossing into friendship. Dottie Vane ran a tight office. Everyone in county administration knew that. She was competent and careful and not given to shortcuts. Dottie looked at the documents without picking them up first. She leaned over the counter, reading from the top glasses still on their chain, her expression professionally neutral, in a way that told Ruth she had already been briefed by Garrett and was now forming her own assessment independently. Then she came around to the public side of the counter, not behind the desk, around it. She pulled the other plastic chair from beside the water cooler and positioned it across from Ruth, the way someone sat when they wanted a conversation rather than a transaction, when they wanted to be level with the person they were talking to rather than above them. "Let me look at these properly," she said. She read slowly, both pages of the transfer document, the mineral rights registration from 2003. She held the 3 returned envelopes by their edges and examined the postmarks, the return to sender stamps, the addresses. When she reached the 2005 transfer and read the property address, Garrison Creek Road, something shifted briefly in her expression. something she hadn't expected to see or that she had expected to see, but not here. Not like this. Not from this particular person sitting across from her. The shift lasted less than a second before her expression settled back into its professional neutrality, and she continued reading. Ruth watched her and held the canvas bag in her lap with both hands. "This transfer is clean," Dottie said, setting the page down with a care that acknowledged its weight. "Notarized, witnessed, filed correctly in 2005. These mineral rights were never part of your marital estate. They came to you by direct designation from your father prior to the filing date of the marriage, and they were never retitled jointly at any point." She set the page down. "That means they are not subject to division in your divorce proceedings. They cannot be claimed by your husband as marital property. They belong to you independently, exactly as they have since 2005. Ruth did not say anything. "If a company has been attempting to reach you about a lease," Dottie continued, her voice even and unhurried in the way of someone who understood that being unhurried was itself a form of respect, that rushing through important information was a way of signaling that you didn't think the other person needed time to process it. "You have the right to negotiate that independently. No other signature is required. Not your husband's, not his attorney's, yours alone." She tapped the transfer document once with one finger. "This name here," she said, "that's yours. It stands on its own. Nobody can walk past it as though it isn't there." Ruth's hands tightened slightly on the canvas bag. "You need to speak with an attorney before you take any other steps," Dottie said. "Do not sign anything, not for the energy company, not for anyone connected to your husband, not for anyone who represents themselves as trying to help you simplify the situation." She said simplify with a small specific pause before it. The pause of a woman who had heard that word used as a mechanism too many times to hear it without recognizing the mechanism. Ruth gathered her papers and returned them to the envelope. She stood up. "Thank you," she said. Dottie nodded. Then, just as Ruth turned toward the door, Dottie said, "Has Warren been in contact with this office recently, in any capacity?" Ruth turned back. "Not that I'm aware of," she said. Dottie nodded again. Did not explain. Did not add anything. Folded her hands on her knee in a way that settled and closed the conversation the way a well-kept file closed when you pressed the cover down, and looked at Ruth with an expression that was professionally warm and gave nothing else away. Outside, Ruth stood beside her car for a moment before getting in. Dottie Vane had been kind, had been genuinely helpful, had told her everything she needed to know in the right order with care, and then, at the end, had asked about Warren. Ruth hadn't registered the question fully in the moment. She registered it now. In 31 years of records work, she had learned that the questions people asked on their way out of a room were almost always the questions they had been carrying since before you walked in. The question asked at the door was the one that mattered most, and that the person wasn't ready to ask until you were already leaving, when the answer could be absorbed without requiring a response. She got in the car and drove back toward Garrison Creek Road. She was 3 miles from the turnoff when she became aware of a vehicle behind her on the county road, moving at a distance that remained constant rather than closing or falling back the specific distance of someone following while attempting to appear not to be. She watched the rearview mirror for 2 miles without changing her speed or her direction. When she turned onto the gravel lane at Garrison Creek Road, the vehicle continued on the county road without slowing. She noted it, filed it in the sequence she was building. That afternoon, she sat at the pine table with a yellow legal pad and a pen and wrote down everything she could remember in the order it had happened, every date she could pin down, what was said and what wasn't, what she had signed over 31 years and when. What Warren had said about this property specifically, including the exact words across the entire course of the marriage. She wrote it the way she had trained clerks to document discrepancies. Just the facts, just the sequence, without interpretation, because the sequence itself would tell its story to anyone who knew how to read it. And she knew how to read it. She was still writing when she heard the vehicle come down the lane. Not a car, an SUV. She heard the tires on the gravel before she saw the lights through the curtain gap, moving deliberately slowly the way vehicles moved when the driver was paying careful attention to something other than simply arriving. Ruth went to the window. Travis Calla's gray SUV was parked at the edge of the clearing, the dealership sticker still on the rear window. He came around the front of it carrying 2 paper cups with the green logo of a coffee chain whose nearest location was 40 minutes south on Route 23. 40 minutes south, which meant he had either left in a hurry and driven fast, or he had known for some time that he was coming here today. Neither of those explanations was the one he would offer. He had on a polo shirt the color of a swimming pool and leather shoes that had never touched a gravel road before today and were registering their objection in real time. He looked at the cabin with the assessing expression of a man reviewing a property that had not been photographed to its best advantage. Ruth opened the door before he knocked. "Mom, Ruth?" He smiled and extended one of the cups. "I've been trying to reach you." She took the coffee. She did not say she knew that. They sat on the porch steps, the 2 that held weight, not the 2 that didn't, and Travis asked if she was warm enough, if she had what she needed, if she'd eaten. He said his father was worried. He said he himself was worried. He said 31 years was a long time, and the way things had ended wasn't right. And he said that last part in the particular tone of someone who wanted acknowledgement for naming something without actually being willing to do anything about the thing they had named. Ruth drank her coffee and listened. She had spent 31 years reading documents that people handed her without fully understanding what they contained. She had learned that the most consequential information was rarely in the body text. It was in the margins and the attachments and the small print on the reverse side that people signed without turning the page over. She had also learned across those same 31 years that people who arrived bearing things coffee concern. The performance of worry were almost always there for something that couldn't be carried in their hands. Dad mentioned there might be some old paperwork out here, Travis said. He said it in the voice of someone who had been building toward this sentence for the past 10 minutes and had finally reached it. Old properties tend to have loose ends. He just wants to make sure nobody takes advantage of the situation. You know how he worries. Ruth looked at him directly. "How did your father know I was here?" she asked. "He worries," Travis said. "You know how he is." She did. That was precisely the point. "If there are any documents related to the property," Travis continued, settling into the comfortable ease of a man who had delivered this kind of pitch many times and found it generally effective. "It might be simpler if Dad's attorney took a look, just to make sure everything is clear, just to protect your interests in all of this." Ruth set her coffee cup on the porch rail. She looked at Travis, at the careful, coached relaxation of his posture. She had known this person since he was 6 years old and struggling with his reading and needed someone to sit with him at a kitchen table and go through the same sentences until they stopped being obstacles. She had done that without being asked and without expecting anything in return, because that was how she had understood care to work. You gave it where it was needed, and you didn't keep a ledger. She understood now that other people had been keeping a ledger the whole time. "I'll handle my own paperwork," she said. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, warm, engineered to succeed. It was Warren's smile, 30 years younger, and somewhat smoother built on the same foundation. She had spent 31 years learning to read what came after that smile. He finished his coffee and used a marker from his shirt pocket to write his number on the cup lid in neat block letters. Added call anytime, Mom Ruth. Set the cup on the porch rail beside hers with the care of a man leaving something he fully expected to be retrieved. She watched his SUV back down the lane until the tree line absorbed it. Then she picked up the cup and turned the lid over. On the underside of the cardboard printed small Calla and Daily Property Solutions, Lexington, Kentucky, a real estate investment firm. The registered address was on Commerce Street, the same block as Warren's attorney, Frank Daly, whose name appeared on the letterhead of every piece of legal correspondence Ruth had received from Warren's side in the past 3 months. Ruth did not throw the cup away. She brought it inside and placed it upright in the paper bag she'd been using for trash, carefully, the way she had handled mail at the records office that had been opened and resealed between the sender and the recipient. That category of mail always meant someone had wanted to know what was inside before it reached the person it was addressed to. She added Travis's visit to her legal pad, the time of arrival, what was said in sequence, the company name on the underside of the lid, the 40-minute drive each way that no one made on impulse. She was still writing when she heard a second vehicle. This one did not come down the lane. It stopped at the end at the county road. Through the window, she could see in the fading afternoon light a pickup truck she didn't recognize pulled to the shoulder. Driver's door open. A woman standing with one foot on the running board and a spiral notebook open against her forearm, writing in it with a pen. Around 50, maybe 53. Flannel shirt, hair gone salt and pepper pulled back with minimal ceremony. Writing on paper with a pen, not on a screen, the specific choice of someone who wrote for the act of writing rather than for the convenience of the device. Ruth went outside. "You're on private property," she said. Not aggressive, just clear the way facts were clear. The woman looked up. "I know, I'm sorry. I was about to knock." She closed the notebook. "My name is Joe Merritt. I write for the Pike County Examiner." She said it the way people announced professional affiliations when they expected the announcement to be examined. "I've been working on a story about mineral rights in this county, specifically about women who have lost them or nearly lost them during divorce proceedings without fully understanding what they were giving away." Her voice was even delivering information without editorializing, trusting the information to carry its own weight. 3 properties in Pike County have been flagged in the county records as having active mineral rights, with no established contact for the designated holder. This property is one of them. I spoke with a woman named Carla Steins at the county assessor's office. She said if anyone knew what to do with a property that had been sitting without a proper record keeper, it was the former head of land records. A pause. "She said you were the best they ever had." Ruth looked at the notebook. Wire binding bent from heavy use. Coffee ring on the back cover. Pen tucked into the spiral. These were not props. These were tools that had been used for a long time in the same way. "What do you want?" Ruth asked. "A conversation, and if you have documents, I'd like to see them." "What does that accomplish for me?" Joe didn't reach for warmth or urgency. She answered straight. "Attention," she said, "is the one thing men like Warren Calla cannot control." She said his name without pause or qualification, which meant she had already been in the records, which meant she was considerably further along than her opening had suggested. "A story in print changes what he can do quietly," Joe said. "It doesn't fix everything, but it makes quiet a great deal harder to sustain." The wind moved through the tall grass along the road. Down the hill on Route 7, a truck engine turned over and faded going west. Ruth had spent 31 years watching what people did with information they had been trusted with, who held it carefully and who used it carelessly, and who understood that possessing information was not the same thing as earning the right to use it. Joe Merritt had driven to Garrison Creek Road with a paper notebook and a name she'd gotten from a county assessor working the slow way, which was the only way that held. "How did you find the other 2 properties?" Ruth asked. "One came to me through a source I can't name. The second I found through deed transfer records." Joe turned a page without looking down. Both properties had active mineral rights that were signed away or nearly signed away in divorce proceedings. Both women received significantly less than fair market value, and in both cases the same name appears in the surrounding paperwork. Not Warren's name directly, connected to him. She looked up. "I'm not ready to print that name yet. I need more. Ruth stood with her hand on the fence post at the edge of the lane, cold wood rough under her palm. October had finally committed to what it was going to be. How many women? Ruth asked. Joe looked at her notebook, then back up. 3 confirmed. I believe there are more. The wind moved through the grass. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Sometimes a number was sufficient. 3 women, 3 properties. 3 times the same mechanism had operated quietly in the background, while something that belonged to someone was moved to someone else. Come inside, Ruth said. She walked up the lane without waiting to see if Joe followed. Behind her, she heard the pickup door close and Joe's footsteps on the gravel steady and unhurried, keeping pace. They sat at the pine table for 2 hours. Joe read every document with care, asked precise questions, wrote the answers in her notebook in the same even hand she'd used standing at the road. She did not reach for drama. She did not tell Ruth what to feel about what she was seeing. She treated the documents as records, as evidence of what had actually occurred, independent of anyone's interpretation of it. At the end of 2 hours, Joe closed her notebook and looked across the table. I need to pull public records from Appalachian Mineral Group, she said. There may be more in their files than what you have here. I can file the request today. Ruth nodded. Joe wrote her direct line on the back of a business card, held it with 2 fingers on the table for a moment before sliding it across. Write down everything you remember, she said, in order. Dates where you have them approximate where you don't. Write it the way you document a records discrepancy. Just the facts. Just the sequence. Ruth looked at the legal pad at the far end of the table. She had already been doing exactly that. I know how to document things, she said. Joe almost smiled. I know you do. That's why I drove up here. After Joe left, Ruth sat at the table and kept writing. The October light crossed the floorboards in the long, flat way it did at this time of year, reaching the far wall. The wood stove put out steady heat. Outside, the tall grass moved. She was still writing at 6:20 in the evening when the headlights swept across the kitchen wall. She went to the window. Warren's truck was at the edge of the clearing. She could see the shape of him in the driver's seat, still the way he was, still before difficult conversations, composing himself, selecting his approach. She had watched him do this for 31 years. The pause before he came through a door. The breath he took in the hallway. The hand on the frame. He sat for 4 minutes. Then he got out and knocked, 3 times, evenly spaced. The knock of a man who had never needed to use force because doors had always opened when he expected them to. Ruth opened the door but did not step aside. Ruth. He had always used her full name when he was managing something, managing her, managing a situation, managing the gap between what he wanted and what was currently the case. I've been worried about you. She said nothing. His eyes went past her shoulder into the cabin. One quick professional scan, the legal pad, the manila envelope on the table, whether anyone else was present. He processed it and came back to her face. "This place isn't safe," he said. "The roof has been leaking for years. There's no reliable heat. You're out here alone and no one knows where you are." "I know where I am," she said. He nodded slowly with the measured patience of a man appearing to consider something he had already dismissed.
"My attorney could come out," he said. "Take a look at whatever your father left, just to make sure nothing gets complicated, just so nobody takes advantage of the situation."
There it was, word for word what Travis had said. The same script handed down and delivered by two different people in the same week. A family that used identical language had gotten that language from somewhere, and the somewhere was always a conversation that had happened before the visits began. "I have my own attorney," Ruth said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. Warren rarely showed anger in its raw form. Recalculation. The adjustment of a man who had prepared for one conversation and was now being presented with a different one entirely. "Ruth." His voice dropped into the lower register, the one he used when he wanted to sound like he was being generous with private information. "You don't need to make this harder than it has to be. I'm trying to help you here." Then he put his hand on the doorframe. Not stepping in, just placing his hand there on the frame of a door that was on a cabin that had been in her family since before he existed, in a gesture so habitual that she doubted he was fully aware of making it. The hand that reminded both people in the conversation who he believed had claim to any given space. Ruth looked at his hand, then looked at the lock plate. Brass. Still bright at the edges where the screwdriver had caught the metal during installation. She had bought it 4 days ago at the hardware store in Pikeville and put it in her self-tools laid out on a dish towel in the order she would need them, the way her father had taught her to set up a job before starting it. Warren's eyes found the lock. She watched him understand it. Not just that it was new, that it had been new before he arrived, that she had changed the lock knowing he would come, which meant she had not been simply reacting to events, she had been ahead of them. The woman in this doorway was not the same woman he had left on the porch on Clover Ridge Road, holding a suitcase she hadn't packed and a key that didn't fit. "This isn't Clover Ridge Road," Ruth said. "You don't have a key to this lock." He took his hand off the frame. The careful expression held for a moment longer. Then something beneath it changed, not dramatically, not in any way he would have permitted if he had been paying full attention to himself. But she had spent 31 years learning to read him. "You're going to make things very complicated for yourself," he said. Quiet, nearly gentle, the way a thing was said when the speaker wanted it received as a warning without it being classifiable as a threat. Ruth began to close the door. He stood on the porch until the gap was nearly gone. Then she heard his boots on the gravel, the truck door, the engine. She stood at the closed door and listened to him back down the lane, and when she could no longer hear the truck, she went to the window anyway. He stopped at the end of the lane where it met the county road. Didn't pull out. just stopped. And in the dark, a small blue light appeared inside the cab, the glow of a phone screen illuminating the shape of his face from below. He was making a call before he had cleared the property. 22 minutes later, her phone buzzed on the table. Travis. Just checking in, Mom. Ruth. Let me know if you need anything. Ruth set the phone face down. Then she pressed both palms flat on top of the wood stove, still warm from the afternoon fire. She stood there with the heat working up through her hands and into her arms, and she breathed the way her father had taught her to breathe when something was larger than she felt ready to be alone with. Slow, from the bottom. Give it a count. She had known Warren would come. She had known Travis would come first. She had installed the lock and built the documentation and sat across from a reporter with a paper notebook, and she had done all of it without flinching. Her hands were shaking. She stood at the stove until they stopped. It took less time than she expected. Joe called at 7:15 the following morning. Ruth had been awake since before 5, sitting at the pine table with instant coffee and the legal pad, the kitchen window going slowly from black to gray to the particular pale light that came just before full dawn in the mountains when the ridgeline caught the first of it and the clearing below was still in shadow. "I got the records from Appalachian Mineral Group," Joe said. No preamble, the voice of someone who had been working for hours already. "Public records request. They came through last night." Ruth set down her coffee cup. "There's a memorandum of agreement in their files," Joe said, dated March 2022. "It covers a preliminary lease arrangement for the mineral rights at the Garrison Creek Road property, Pike County." A pause that was short and deliberate. "The signature on the document on the designated line for the mineral rights holder reads Ruth May Calla." The frost on the fence outside the window. The legal pad. The pen she had set down. "That's not my signature," Ruth said. "No," Joe said. "It isn't." She explained what she had done. She had pulled Ruth's notarized signature from the 2005 mineral rights transfer, the original on file in the county record system, the document Ruth had shown her at the pine table 2 evenings before. She had placed it next to the signature on the 2022 memorandum. The name was correct. The hand was not. Ruth wrote her capital R the same way she had written it for 57 years since her father had taught her at the kitchen table on Sycamore Street when she was 7 years old. He had been left-handed, and he taught the way a left-handed man naturally taught someone sitting across from him, which meant that what felt natural and correct to him produced a mirror image in her. She began the R with a downward stroke before the hump, a small leftward pull at the base before the leg extended. It was the exact reverse of how most right-handed people wrote the letter. She had written it that way every day for 57 years on every form and document and letter and birthday card she had ever signed, without ever thinking about it as anything other than simply how you wrote an R. The signature on the 2022 memorandum had begun the R the standard way. Hump first, then the leg. the way a right-handed person wrote it without thinking, without knowing there was any other way. Warren had known her name. He had not known her hand. "He sent it by email," Joe said. "The memorandum, scanned copy sent from his personal email account to the land acquisition office in Pittsburgh. That's documented in the company's records." Another pause shorter. "Ruth, that's not just document forgery. That's wire fraud. That's a federal charge." Ruth did not speak for a moment. Outside the window, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the clearing. It looked at the cabin with the direct, unsentimental appraisal of a crow, as though assessing whether the situation warranted further attention. Then it flew off. "There's something else," Joe said. In the 18 months before Ruth had walked into the Pike County Land Records office with her manila envelope, 3 separate requests had been filed to update the contact information for the Garrison Creek Road property, to establish an active mailing address so that correspondence from energy companies could reach the designated mineral rights holder. All 3 were still in the processing queue, marked pending review, all 3 assigned to the same clerk. Ruth looked at the frost along the fence rails outside. White and precise, laid down overnight without announcement. "Dottie Vane," she said. The line was quiet. "3 requests," Joe said. "Same clerk, all still pending, going on 2 years. Ruth stood up from the table, not because she had somewhere to be, because sitting still was no longer something her body was willing to do. She went to the window and looked out at the lane, the frost on the rails thin and very white. She thought about Dottie Vane coming around to the public side of the counter, sitting across from her rather than above her, telling her the transfer was clean, her name stood on its own, nobody could walk past it, telling her not to sign anything. And then asking on her way out, has Warren been in contact with this office recently? Dottie had recognized the Garrison Creek Road address the moment she read it. Ruth had seen it in that brief shift of expression that lasted less than a second before professional neutrality closed back over it. She had known the property, known it was connected to Warren, had known all of it before Ruth sat down, and had still come around to the public side, had still told the truth about the documents, had still given her the advice she needed, and then had kept 3 requests in a processing queue for 2 years, making certain that the mailing address corrections that would have put the energy company's correspondence in Ruth's hands never cleared. The 2 things existed at the same time, in the same person. That was what made it complicated. Dottie had not built the scheme. She had held one door partially closed for a man who had offered her son a favorable land deal in exchange for the small, quiet, administratively invisible service of keeping 3 forms in a pending queue. She had received the bargain and kept her end of it. And then, when Ruth had walked in with the actual documents in a canvas grocery bag, Dottie had looked at her across a counter and had not been able to make herself continue. That was the part Ruth had to figure out what to do with. The help given and the harm done by the same hands. She didn't think there was a clean feeling available about that combination. She didn't think she was supposed to find one. "Is this enough for the story?" Ruth asked. "It's enough to start," Joe said. "But I need you willing to be named. Your full name, your own account of what happened. Without that, it's documents. With that, it's a person. A person is significantly harder to make disappear than a paper trail." Ruth looked up at the wall above the door. The hunting vest, the wool jacket, the blue canvas cap on its nail brim curved from 40 years of the same hand, the shape of one man's habit pressed permanently into the fabric. Her father had put her name alone, on a legal document in 2005, had made certain it was filed and notarized and witnessed and recorded, had sealed the supporting documents in a tin box under a floorboard, and given her the key in a cedar box with his handwriting pressed hard into paper. "Don't let anyone tell you this is nothing." He had done all of it quietly without telling her. She had asked herself why in the weeks since the cabin. She had come to believe that he had not told her because telling her would have required explaining why it was necessary, and explaining why it was necessary would have required him to say directly what he thought about the man she had married. Her father had not been that kind of man. He had been the kind who prepared the thing and trusted her to find it. He had been right. He had put her name on everything worth keeping. "I can put it on this too," Ruth said. On the other end of the line, Joe was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth heard a pen click open. The days that followed were the days that would later feel in memory like a gear turning. Each piece engaging the next setting something larger in motion that had started small with a cedar box in the bottom of a suitcase, with an iron key in a palm going from cold to warm in a motel room in the middle of the night. Ruth drove back to Pikeville the next morning earlier than she had to, and went to the hardware store on Commerce Street before it had fully opened. She bought a padlock for the chain she intended to run across the entrance to the lane, a set of motion-activated lights for the front porch, and a small battery-powered alarm for the cabin door. She paid cash and drove back. She installed the chain that afternoon, threading it through the iron post at the lane entrance and locking it with the padlock, leaving the key on the ring with the iron key and the new cabin door key. 3 keys now. Each one a door, each door a different kind of protection. The motion lights she mounted on the porch corners, aiming them at the clearing. The alarm she set on the door at night. She had not told Joe about the car that had followed her on the county road after her visit to the land records office. She had noted it on her legal pad and had spent time thinking about whether it was worth mentioning. She had concluded that it was a data point without sufficient context. It could have been Warren, could have been Travis, could have been unrelated entirely. A data point without context was just noise. She had learned that from 31 years of records work, and she applied it here. But 2 days after Joe's call, when Ruth returned from a morning drive to Pikeville for groceries, she found the cabin unlocked. She was certain she had locked it. She had developed a specific routine key in the lock turn. Pull the door to check resistance, count to 3, leave. She had done it that morning. She knew it With the same certainty, she knew which step creaked third from the top on a staircase she would never walk again. The door was unlocked when she returned. Inside, everything was where she had left it. Mostly. The tin box on the pine table had been moved 4 inches to the left. She could see the outline of where it had sat in the fine layer of dust she hadn't gotten to yet. The accordion folder inside it was intact, the documents all present. The cedar box on the shelf above the sink appeared untouched. Nothing was missing. Something had been photographed. She understood this the same way she understood records fraud. Not because she could prove it in that moment, but because she recognized the signature of it. Someone had come in, reviewed the documents, taken images of what they needed, and left everything in place. The goal was not to take the evidence. The goal was to know what evidence existed before deciding how to respond to it. This was different from Warren standing on the porch saying you're going to make things very complicated for yourself. This was someone who had decided to find out exactly what they were dealing with before the next move. Ruth stood in the middle of her father's kitchen for a long moment. Then she called Joe. "Document it," Joe said when Ruth had described what she found. "Write down exactly what was moved and by how much. Take photographs of where things are now and move the originals somewhere they aren't." "Where would you suggest?" "Not the cabin," Joe said. Ruth drove to Pikeville that afternoon and opened a safe deposit box at the bank on River Street, the same bank where she would later deposit the first check from Appalachian Mineral Group. She transferred the original documents, the mineral rights registration, the 2005 transfer, the 3 returned envelopes, the memorandum of agreement from Appalachian Mineral Group that Joe had obtained through the public records request. She kept copies at the cabin in the accordion folder in the tin box on the pine table exactly where they had been found. Let whoever had come in look at the copies. The originals were somewhere they could not reach. She drove back to Garrison Creek Road. That evening, she sat at the table and thought about what kind of person broke into a cabin and photographed documents instead of taking them. What that calculus was. You didn't take them because taking them would tell the owner that you had been there and what you had seen. You photographed them because you wanted the information without announcing that you now had it. You wanted to know what you were up against before the other person knew you knew. It was, she thought, the kind of move that a man who tracked receipts made. A man who believed that information was a resource and that having it before the other person was always the correct position. Warren had been gathering information about her position the same way he had been doing everything else quietly in the margins, without announcing himself until the moment was right. She added the break-in to her legal pad. Date time of departure, time of return, what was displaced, and by what degree. She added the photograph of the displaced tin box she had taken on her phone. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep quickly, but she slept. 3 days later, Travis came back. He came without coffee this time. He came in the early evening, and he stood at the end of the lane she had put the chain up, and he called to her from there, his voice carrying across the clearing with the specific quality of a man who had been told to try again and didn't quite have his heart in it. "Mom, Ruth, can we just talk?" Ruth was on the porch. She had seen the headlights through the window and had come outside not because she wanted to talk to Travis, but because she preferred to see things clearly rather than through curtain gaps. "I can hear you from here," she said. He stood at the chain. He looked at it the way he had looked at the cabin on his first visit, the expression of someone encountering an obstacle they had not been briefed about.
"This is getting complicated," he said. "Dad's attorney is saying there are some questions about the property documentation, about how the transfer was filed. There may be irregularities that could affect the validity of—" "Travis," Ruth said. He stopped. "Your father sent me a forged document by email," she said. "That's wire fraud. That's a federal charge. The question of whether the 2005 transfer has irregularities is not the question your father should be asking right now."
The silence that followed was the silence of a man processing something that did not match the version of events he had been given. Travis was not a stupid person. He was a lawyer. He was capable of understanding what she had just said and what it implied about what he had been told. "I didn't know about that," he said. His voice was different, quieter. The practiced ease was gone. "I believe you," Ruth said. She did believe him. Travis had been deployed as an instrument in this, without being given the full picture, which was itself a kind of thing Warren did. He gave people partial information and used their reasonable response to the partial information to accomplish what full information would have caused them to refuse. "Go home, Travis," she said. "Talk to someone who isn't your father's attorney." He stood at the chain for another moment. Then he got back in his SUV and drove away, and this time she watched him go, and he didn't stop at the end of the lane to make a call. She noted this too. Joe called 4 days after that. "I have something," she said, and her voice had the quality it had when something had come through that she hadn't been certain would come through. She had gone back into the county record system and pulled the processing logs for the Land Records Division, the internal administrative records that tracked when documents were received, who they were assigned to, and when action was taken. This was information that required a specific public records request, different from the deed records, and it had taken her longer to obtain. In the processing logs, she had found the 3 requests to update the contact information for the Garrison Creek Road property. Filed by Appalachian Mineral Group directed to the Pike County Land Records Office, requesting that the mailing address for Arcala on Garrison Creek Road be updated to an active forwarding address. All 3 assigned to Dottie Vane within 48 hours of receipt. All 3 marked pending review. All 3 still sitting in the queue. And in the margin notes of the second request, the 2021, a small notation in what Joe said appeared to be a different hand than the standard clerk entry. Hold per W. C. November 4th, 2021. W.C. November 4th, 2021. "That's enough to name her," Joe said.
and enough to name him.
Ruth was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the clearing. The tall grass had gone fully brown now. The young oak against the left window had begun dropping its leaves, the branches slowly uncovering the glass. "When do you plan to run it?" she asked. "As soon as you're ready to be named," Joe said. Ruth thought about her father driving himself to a notary's office in 2005. She thought about the margin note in the processing log, hold per WC. She thought about 3 women in Pike County who had received less than a fifth of what their rights were worth, whose names were not going to appear in any newspaper, who would read the story if they read it, and recognize the shape of what had been done to them, and possibly finally understand it. "Run it," Ruth said. The story ran on a Thursday. Ruth bought 2 copies from the stand outside the hardware store on Commerce Street in Pikeville. She sat in the car in the parking lot and read it there with the engine off and the November cold working in through the windows steadily the way cold worked when you were sitting still. Joe Merritt wrote the way she worked. Plain, precise, nothing decorative. The headline ran across the top of the local section in clean black type, mineral rights missing signatures, and the women who didn't know what they were signing away. 3 cases documented. 2 women identified by county and year only at their own request. 1 woman named in full. Ruth May Calla, 64, Pike County, Kentucky. She read her name the way she had read it on the transfer document weeks earlier, sitting at her father's pine table with the manila envelope open and the iron key beside her. Once for the information. Once to make sure it was real. She folded 1 copy and put it in the glove box. The other she left on the passenger seat, flat the headline facing up. Then she drove back to Garrison Creek Road. The story named Warren Calla. Not as the direct party to the transfers, the legal structure had been careful enough to put other names in the primary positions, but as the presence in the margins. The name connected to the entities. Calla and Daily Property Solutions. The registered addresses that appeared in the documentation surrounding all 3 cases at the moments that mattered most. It named Frank Daly. It named the margin note, hold per WC, November 4th, 2021. It described the mechanism by which mineral rights designated to women in their own names had moved during divorce proceedings toward entities connected to the same individual, through administrative delays, through documents signed without full understanding, through the particular opacity of a county record system that most people interacted with only when they were already in the middle of something they didn't fully understand. It did not name Dottie Vane directly. Joe had told Ruth she wasn't ready to print that yet. She needed the internal review to move first so the story would have official confirmation rather than allegation. The margin note was evidence. It wasn't yet a finding. Ruth read the article twice in the car and then a 3rd time at the pine table that evening, with a cup of tea checking the sequence of facts against her legal pad line by line. Joe had gotten every date right, every document correctly described, every connection drawn only as far as the evidence supported it, which was exactly as far as it needed to go. That was the thing about working the slow way. When it held entirely. She folded the second copy of the paper and set it on the shelf above the sink next to the 3 jars of dried herbs from the farmer's market in Pikeville. She didn't know exactly why she kept it there rather than in the accordion folder with the other documents. Only that it felt right to keep it somewhere she could see it from across the room. To let it exist in the ordinary space of the kitchen rather than in the protected, organized space of the records. Her name in print, her name on its own, the way her father had always intended it to stand. The calls started within 24 hours of the paper running. Not calls to her. She had stopped answering numbers she didn't recognize 2 weeks earlier, and Travis had been calling from the same number she had stored and could ignore with 2 taps. The calls were to Joe's editor at the Pike County Examiner, to the county clerk's office, to Aaron Sykes, whom Joe had mentioned by name in the article as a property rights attorney who had agreed to review the cases of all 3 women. Ruth knew about the calls because Joe told her about them and because Aaron Sykes called her directly on the second day to say he had received 3 separate communications from attorneys representing Warren Calla and entities connected to him, all of which he had declined to engage with.
They're trying to find the edges of what's there,
Aaron said. He was measured and precise and did not seem troubled by this, which Ruth found reassuring. That's what this kind of pressure is for. They want to know what you have and whether you'll hold it. I'll hold it, Ruth said. I know, he said. I read the article. The pressure lasted 9 days. Calls. Texts from Travis increasingly less certain in tone as the days went on. The scripted ease falling away to something that sounded more like a person genuinely uncertain what to do. A certified letter from Frank Daly's office making a series of legal assertions about the 2005 transfer that Aaron Sykes had read called creative and advised her to file unopened with the records she was building. Travis appearing twice at the end of the lane both times, stopping at the chain, calling across the clearing, leaving when she didn't come out. On the 8th day, Ruth put a padlock on the chain across the lane entrance. She didn't put up a sign. She didn't need to. On the 9th day, the calls stopped. The texts stopped. The silence that followed was complete and immediate, like a sound cutting off rather than fading, the specific silence of people who had stopped talking because they had started listening to lawyers. Ruth knew this silence. It had a particular density to it, a managed quality, the silence of a decision being made in a room she wasn't in. She was not afraid of it. On the 5th day of silence, Joe called. The county clerk's office opened an internal review this morning, Joe said. They're looking at the processing queue in the Land Records Division, specifically the pending requests that have been sitting without action. Ruth was at the table with her coffee. November had arrived overnight. She could see it in the color of the grass along the lane, the yellow-brown of a season that had made its decision. "And Dottie Vane?" Ruth asked. A pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know. The pause of someone making sure they said it correctly. "Administrative leave," Joe said. "As of yesterday." Ruth looked out the kitchen window. A flat gray morning, the kind that made no promises. I thought you'd want to know, Joe said. Yes, Ruth said. Thank you. A short silence. Then Joe. How are you doing with it? Ruth considered the question. Dottie Vane had come around to the public side of the counter, had sat level with her, had told her the transfer was clean, her name stood on its own, nobody could walk past it, had told her not to sign anything, and had said simplify with that pause before it, the pause of someone who recognized the mechanism, had said all of it with the steady, unhurried care of a woman who understood exactly what kind of situation Ruth was in. And the whole time, 3 requests sat in Dottie's queue. 3 forms that, if processed, would have put the energy company's correspondence in Ruth's hands years before any of this had to happen. Dottie had not built what Warren built. She had held one door closed for a man who had offered her son a favorable land deal in exchange. Small, quiet, administratively invisible. The kind of thing that didn't feel like harm until you saw it from the other side, from the perspective of the person the door was being held closed against. And then when Ruth had walked in with the documents in a canvas grocery bag, Dottie had looked at her and had not been able to continue, had come around the counter, had told the truth, had warned her, the help given and the harm done, the same hands, the same person at the same time. She made her choice, Ruth said, same as all of us. Joe didn't say anything for a moment. Then, yes, I think that's right. After she hung up, Ruth sat with her coffee and thought about the women she hadn't met. The 2 who had asked not to be named. One in the eastern part of the county. One further south, closer to the Virginia line. Women who had signed documents they hadn't fully understood in the middle of situations that were already overwhelming and had received less than 1/5 of what their rights were worth. Who had gone on to smaller lives in smaller spaces while the value of what they had owned without knowing it moved to people who had understood it perfectly. She didn't know their names. She knew their situations from the documents, from the shape of what had been done to them, which was the same shape as what had nearly been done to her. The same logic, the same mechanism, slight variations in the specific documents. The same man in the margins. 3 women. Probably more. She thought about her father. Harlan Goss had been a man of moderate means and deliberate care. 30 years with the County Road Department. The house on Sycamore Street owned outright by retirement. Tools, organized paperwork filed. Word kept, a man who understood that reliability was not a virtue you performed, but a practice you maintained, because the people depending on you deserved to have something they could count on. He had also, in 2005, driven himself to a notary's office and transferred the mineral rights to a piece of mountain property into his daughter's name alone. Not her married name, not the name attached to the marriage, the name he had given her, the one that belonged to her before anyone else had any claim on any part of her life. She had not known he was doing it. He had not told her. And she had asked herself why many times, sitting at the pine table in the evenings. She had come to believe that he had not told her because telling her would have required explaining why it was necessary. Explaining why it was necessary, would have required him to say directly and plainly what he thought of the man she had married. He had not been the kind of man who said that kind of thing. He had been the kind who put the thing in the cedar box and trusted her to find it when she needed it. He had been right about the timing. 15 years in a house where the box sat on whatever shelf Warren had decided it belonged on, unexamined, unvalued. And then, when the window was closing and the stakes were highest and the thing that could stop Warren was needed most, he had packed it himself. He had put it in her suitcase. He had handed it to her and driven away. Some men never look down. That was the thing about them. 2 weeks after the paper ran, a letter arrived from Appalachian Mineral Group. Formal, 3 paragraphs on company letterhead. The memorandum of agreement from March 2022 had been suspended pending signature investigation. All further contact regarding the Garrison Creek Road mineral rights was to be directed to the designated rights holder of record, Ruth May Calla. She read that phrase twice, put the letter in the accordion folder in the correspondence section behind the ongoing tab. 31 years of records work did not become irrelevant simply because the records were now personal. The call from Aaron Sykes came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the article. He had read the piece when it ran. He had pulled the public records himself. The processing logs, the margin notation, the memorandum, and had formed his assessment before calling. He worked on contingency for cases involving mineral rights disputes and deed irregularities, which meant no fee unless there was a recovery. His voice was measured and unhurried. She asked him 3 questions. What the process looked like, how long it typically took, what she would need to provide. He answered all 3 without making her feel foolish for asking. When she hung up, she sat at the table with the legal pad and added 1 more line to the notes. Request all communications between Warren Calla and Appalachian Mineral Group 2019 to present. She underlined it once. December came to Garrison Creek Road the way it always came to the mountains of eastern Kentucky, quietly overnight, without announcement, leaving frost on the fence rails, and a particular flatness in the light, and a cold in the air that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the year contracting toward its stillest point. 2 months had passed since the paper ran. The lawsuit was open. Aaron Sykes sent updates in short, factual emails when there was something to update, which was how she had told him she preferred to receive information. The internal review at the county clerk's office was ongoing. Joe called occasionally a second property flagged in the record system, a reporter at a Lexington paper who had picked up the story and was following the Calla and Daily thread into the city where the firm's commercial real estate operations had a longer and more complex history. The cabin looked the same from the lane. Inside it was different in the ways that counted. The worst section of the roof had been patched in November. Ruth had done the accessible portion herself on a dry Saturday, materials from the hardware store in Pikeville, a tutorial she had watched 4 times on her phone because she believed in watching a thing enough times to understand it before beginning. The upper section she had paid a man named Cecil Prater from Varney to complete. He had come on a Wednesday, looked at the roof for 10 minutes in silence, quoted her a fair price, done the work without asking unnecessary questions about why a woman her age was living alone in a cabin on Garrison Creek Road in November. She appreciated that about Cecil Prater. The kitchen window was new single pane matching the original because double pane would have required a different frame, and she wasn't ready to change the frame yet. The wood stove drew properly now that she'd had the chimney swept by a man from Elkhorn City who arrived with a drop cloth and a wire brush and left 2 hours later with the flue clear and the stove burning clean. She had learned which combination of oak and hickory from the woodpile behind the cabin produced the most reliable heat through a long night. She had learned that the porch steps, both of them needed to be replaced before spring, and had already priced the lumber. She had learned that the cabin's water supply came from a spring-fed line that needed insulation on 2 exposed sections before hard freeze, and had insulated them herself on a cold afternoon with foam pipe wrap and electrical tape, the same kind of tape her father had used to seal the manila envelope in the tin box. She did the work in pieces, one problem at a time, one Saturday at a time, to her own standard, which turned out to be considerably higher than she had remembered having. On the shelf above the sink, 3 jars of dried herbs from the farmer's market in Pikeville, a coffee mug her sister in Knoxville had sent with a card that said nothing about Warren and everything about the specific grace of a woman who knew that sometimes the right support was presence without commentary. And the folded copy of the Pike County Examiner headline facing out. On the windowsill above the sink, where the morning light arrived, first the iron key. She had placed it there the second week after she had moved in properly, after she had used the closet, hung her coat on the hook beside the door, stopped sitting on the edge of the bed. The key belonged on the windowsill, not stored, not hidden, just there, the way things were when they no longer needed to be protected from anyone, when they had become simply part of the life being lived in the space where they rested. On the Monday before Christmas, Ruth went out to the mailbox at 8 in the morning. The lane was frozen at the edges, the center strip still dark, where the ground held enough warmth to resist. Her breath came out in small, even clouds. A line of ice had formed along the top rail of her father's fence. The posts still plumb after 40 years, the wire still taut. The whole thing still holding the way things held when they had been built by someone who understood that the difference between something lasting and something failing was almost entirely in the quality of the original work and the care taken with the details that no one else would ever see. She opened the mailbox. Inside a catalog, she hadn't requested a utility bill she had already paid online, and a single white envelope. No window, no bulk postage. A real stamp in the upper right corner, applied slightly crooked the way stamps were applied by someone moving quickly. Return address, Appalachian Mineral Group, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ruth stood at the end of the lane and opened it there in the December cold. Her father had opened his mail at the mailbox standing in the road regardless of weather. He had said once that if something was coming toward you, it was better to know sooner than to carry it back inside first. Inside a single sheet of company letterhead. 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph, the pending lease arrangement for the Garrison Creek Road mineral rights, had been reinstated following resolution of the signature investigation. The company was prepared to proceed under the terms of the preliminary agreement, modified to reflect the corrected rights holder of record. The second paragraph terms: advance payment, monthly royalty structure, duration. The third paragraph, 3 sentences, all future correspondence directed to her at the Garrison Creek Road address, now on record. No third-party authorization required or accepted for any decisions regarding the rights outlined in this agreement. And the advance payment check enclosed represented the first disbursement under the reinstated arrangement. Ruth looked at the envelope. She reached in and took out the check. It was not a large amount. She had understood from Aaron Sykes how preliminary lease agreements worked. The first disbursement was modest, a fraction of what the full agreement would generate, a fraction of what the original agreement would have paid if it had been executed in her name from the beginning. It would not replace the rest of the roof. It would not recover what the past months had cost in legal consultation and materials and the unquantifiable expense of starting over at 64 with a cracked-handle broom and a cast-iron stove she had learned to use by trial and error over 3 weeks in an October that had not been warm. It was not enough to undo what had been done, but it was real. It was dated, and on the line that read, "Pay to the order of in clean black type, Ruth May Calla." She read it once. She read it again. She stood at the end of the lane in the December cold, with the check in her hand, and her breath coming out in small, steady clouds, and the ice on the top rail of her father's fence, catching the flat winter light. And she read it a third time. Standing alone at the end of a gravel lane off County Route 7 in Pike County, Kentucky, with no one watching and no one waiting, and no one who needed to know what she was looking at or what it meant to be looking at it. Then she folded the check along a single careful crease, put it in her coat pocket, and walked back up the lane. At the bank in Pikeville, the teller's name tag said Bethany. She processed the deposit with efficient warmth, printed the receipt, and slid it across the counter without comment. Then she said, "Would you like to look at opening a savings account alongside the checking? We have a few options." Ruth considered it. "Let me think about it," she said. She drove back to Garrison Creek Road with the deposit receipt in her coat pocket next to where the check had been. The mountains on either side of Route 7 were the gray-brown of December bare ridgelines, showing themselves fully for the first time since spring, the bones of the place visible now that there was nothing left to soften the view. She had lived in Pike County for 64 years. She had spent 31 of them managing the records that said what the land in this county was worth and who it belonged to. She had known the value of mineral rights the way she had known the value of most things in that period of her life, abstractly professionally, as information that applied to other people's situations rather than to anything that was hers. She knew it differently now. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the deposit receipt flat in front of her. The wood stove was going steady and even. The new kitchen window held the dark outside and reflected the kitchen light back in a clean reflection, the kind that came from new glass rather than glass that had been sitting in the same frame for 40 years, gathering the slow opacity of time. She was still getting used to seeing herself in it. Her own face, her own kitchen, her own table and lamp and cup of tea and legal pad. All of it hers in the specific and uncomplicated way things were yours when no one else had any claim on them. On the shelf above the sink, the 3 herb jars, the mug from her sister, the folded newspaper. On the windowsill above the sink, where the morning light came first, the iron key. The cedar box on the shelf beside the herb jars. The tin box on the corner of the table. The accordion folder inside it indexed and tabbed correspondence documents, legal ongoing. Organized the way things were organized when they needed to be findable by anyone who had to make sense of them, including the person who had built the system. Ruth picked up her tea and looked at the wall. The hunting vest, the wool jacket the color of dried leaves, the blue canvas work cap on its nail brim curved from 40 years of the same hand morning and evening. In every season, the shape of one man's habit pressed permanently into the fabric the specific forward tilt that she had been able to identify at a distance for as long as she could remember coming through a tree line at dusk, coming up the front walk after work, coming back from wherever he had gone, reliable and unhurried, and exactly the same every time. She had not taken the cap down. She was not going to take the cap down. Not as preservation, not from reluctance to disturb it, but because it was his exactly where he had left it at the angle he had always left it. And the fact of that, the exact position it occupied on its nail in this room, in this cabin, on this piece of land, said something she didn't need to translate into words to fully understand. He had planned to come back to this place. He had expected that what he left behind would be here when the right person arrived. He had expected her. She looked at the cap, the way you looked at something that had been waiting for you a long time, without complaint, without urgency, in the patient way of things that simply wait and do not require anything from you while they're doing it. She did not say anything to it. She did not need to. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare trees along the ridge and made the sound that bare trees made in winter, dry and sparse and honest, nothing like the sound they made in summer, when the leaves softened everything more truthful. Somehow the sound of things exactly as they were, when there was nothing left to cover them. Ruth sat with her tea until it was gone. Then she got up and washed the cup in the kitchen sink and set it in the drying rack and turned off the lamp on the table. She left the kitchen light on, not from habit, not because she forgot, because the cabin had been dark for 15 years, and the least she could do, the smallest gesture available to her, the one that cost nothing and meant something she didn't have a single complete word for, was to let it be lit. She walked to the bedroom. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Then she moved to the middle of her own bed, in her own room, in her father's cabin on Garrison Creek Road in Pike County, Kentucky. where the mineral rights beneath the property had been registered in her name since 2005, and where the iron key sat on the windowsill in the kitchen, and where the blue canvas cap hung on its nail on the wall above the door at the same angle it had always hung, waiting without complaint, exactly as her father had left it. Warren Calla had taken the house on Clover Ridge Road. He had taken the joint account and the truck they had bought together, and 31 years of a life she had built with more care than he had ever thought to notice. He had taken those things because he had looked at them and understood their value. He had left behind a cedar box, an iron key, and a tin box under a floorboard that he had never once thought to check. Because men like Warren checked account balances and deed records and option window closing dates. They checked the things that were visible and documented and already in the system. They did not look down. They never thought to look down. Ruth lay back in the dark and listened to the wind in the bare trees and the steady, quiet tick of the wood stove working through the cold, and the particular silence of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to come back to it, and had, without drama, without announcement on a Tuesday morning in October, when a woman drove up a gravel lane in first gear because she had been taught to go slow until she knew what she was dealing with, simply gotten what it had been waiting for. The iron key was on the windowsill in the kitchen. In the morning, the light would find it first. It always did.